When Soviet soldiers broke through the gates of Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, the first thing that struck them was the silence. No gunfire, no shouting, no resistance, just silence and smoke still rising from the crematoria. Then came the smell, burning flesh, mixed with human waste and disease and death. Hardened combat veterans, men who'd fought through Stalingrad and Kursk, dropped to their knees and vomited. One officer, Major Anatoly Shapiro, later said he couldn't find words in any language to describe what his eyes were seeing. Moving skeletons emerged from the barracks, not metaphorically, literally, skin stretched over bones, eyes sunken so deep they looked like skulls. Some weighed 60 pounds, some less. Children stood among them, faces blank, unable to process that the nightmare might be ending. The Red Army had liberated hundreds of towns and cities. They'd seen mass graves, destroyed villages, civilians executed in the streets. But nothing prepared them for this, because this wasn't a massacre. This was a factory, an industrial system designed to erase human beings from existence. Over 1.1 million people had been murdered at Auschwitz alone. Jews, Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, political prisoners, homosexuals, the disabled. The Nazis had built an entire infrastructure around death. Railways, gas chambers, crematoria that ran 24 hours a day. And when the Soviets arrived, 7,000 survivors remained, barely alive. This is the story of what happened when Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz and the other death camps across Poland. What they found, what they felt, what they couldn't process, and why their testimonies remain some of the most haunting accounts of the Holocaust. But to understand the liberation, we need to understand what came before it. By January 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. The Red Army was pushing west through Poland. The Americans and British were advancing from the west. The Nazis knew the end was coming, and they knew their camps would be discovered. So they tried to erase the evidence. In the weeks before liberation, the SS forced prisoners out of Auschwitz on death marches, over 60,000 people, driven into the frozen Polish winter. Anyone who couldn't walk was shot. Anyone who stopped was shot. Anyone who fell was shot. Bodies lined the roads for miles. At Auschwitz itself, the Nazis worked frantically to destroy evidence. They blew up crematoria, burned documents, destroyed records, but they ran out of time. When the Red Army's 60th Army approached on January 27th, the remaining SS guards fled. They left behind 7,000 prisoners, too sick or weak to march. The first Soviet units entered cautiously. They expected resistance, maybe a final stand. Booby traps. Instead, they found a ghost camp. The SS had abandoned it hours earlier. Private Ivan Martinushkin was in the lead patrol. He saw the barbed wire, the guard towers, the railroad tracks leading to a massive gate. Then he saw movement in one of the barracks. He raised his rifle. A figure emerged. Not a guard, a prisoner. A woman so thin, her clothes hung off her like rags on a hanger. She stared at the Soviet soldiers. They stared back. Nobody spoke for what felt like minutes. More prisoners began emerging. Dozens, then hundreds, moving slowly, as if in a dream. The Soviet soldiers couldn't process what they were seeing. These weren't people. Not as they understood people. These were something else. The living dead. One soldier dropped his rifle and ran. Just ran. Away from the camp. Into the snow. Nobody blamed him. Major Shapiro ordered his men to search the barracks systematically. They found prisoners packed into wooden bunks stacked 3 high. 6, 7, 8 people in spaces meant for one. The sick lying in their own waste. Some were already dead, but nobody had moved the bodies. In one barracks, they found 600 children, most under 15, many under 10. The Nazis had used them for medical experiments, injections, surgery without anesthesia, twin studies, freezing experiments. A nurse named Yelena Zhigalenko tried to examine a young girl. The girl screamed and wouldn't stop screaming. Soviet soldiers discovered warehouses the Nazis called Canada, rooms stacked floor to ceiling with belongings stolen from prisoners, suitcases, glasses, shoes, mountains of shoes, children's shoes, baby shoes, human hair, 7 tons of it, cut from prisoners and processed for industrial use. In one room, they found 370,000 men's suits, 837,000 women's coats and dresses, thousands of prayer shawls. Each item represented a person, a life, a family that had arrived at Auschwitz believing they were being resettled for work. They had no idea they were walking into an extermination center. Behind the main camp stood 4 massive buildings. The crematoria, even partially destroyed by the fleeing Nazis, the purpose was clear. Industrial ovens, rooms with ventilation systems, underground chambers with shower heads that didn't connect, 2 water pipes, gas chambers disguised as showers. The Soviet investigators pieced together how it worked. Prisoners arrived by train, selection on the platform, those deemed unfit for work, the elderly, children, the sick, sent directly to the gas chambers, sometimes within hours of arrival. The healthy were worked until they couldn't work anymore. Then they were sent to the chambers too. The system was designed for efficiency. The Nazis had calculated death rates, optimized the process, made murder industrial. Soviet officers began recording survivor testimonies immediately. Primo Levi, an Italian Jewish chemist, had survived Auschwitz. He described the selection process. In less than 10 minutes, all the fit men had been collected together in a group. What happened to the others, to the women, to the children, to the old men, we could establish neither then nor later. Survivors told the Soviets about the Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria. They led people to the chambers, removed the bodies after, cleaned the chambers, loaded the ovens. The Nazis killed them every few months and replaced them with new prisoners. Dead men couldn't testify. But some Sonderkommando had survived, and they gave specific numbers. On a single day in summer 1944, during the Hungarian deportations, the camp murdered 24,000 people. In one day. The crematoria couldn't keep up. Bodies were burned in open pits. A prisoner named Vera Alexander told investigators about Dr. Josef Mengele, the angel of death. He conducted experiments on twins, injecting chemicals into their eyes to try to change eye color. Amputations, organ removal, all without anesthesia. When he was done, he killed them. To perform comparative autopsies. In Block 10, Mengele and other doctors performed sterilization experiments on women and children. Radiation, injection of caustic substances, surgical removal of ovaries without consent. The Soviet doctors examining the survivors found evidence of all of it. Scars, radiation burns, surgical wounds that had healed without proper medical care. But the physical wounds were only part of it. A Soviet psychologist named David Heller interviewed survivors. Many couldn't speak. Others spoke in monotones, as if describing someone else's life. Some described a mental state they called musulman, when prisoners had given up, stopped eating, stopped caring, just waited to die. The Soviets had seen combat trauma, shell shock. But this was different. This was something new, something worse. Not all Soviet soldiers could handle what they were seeing. Lieutenant Vasily Petrenko wrote in his diary, "I have seen men die in battle. I have seen civilians executed. I have seen Stalingrad. But this breaks something in the soul that cannot be repaired. Several soldiers requested immediate transfer. Some simply disappeared, walked away and were never seen again. Others felt rage, pure consuming rage. When they encountered SS guards who hadn't escaped, summary executions followed. Soviet commanders didn't stop it. One Soviet officer told his men, "These are not soldiers. They are not even criminals. They are something we have no name for." Soviet photographers and filmmakers arrived within days. They documented everything. The emaciated survivors, the barracks, the crematoria, the warehouses of belongings. The footage was graphic, unflinching, designed to show the world exactly what the Nazis had created. But when the footage was shown, many people didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. British and American officials thought it might be Soviet propaganda, exaggeration for political purposes, until their own forces began liberating camps in the West. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, and found the exact same thing. Auschwitz wasn't unique, it was just the largest. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. The Nazis had built multiple death camps across occupied Poland. Combined, these camps murdered over 3 million people, most within hours of arrival. The Soviets discovered the full scope of the Nazi extermination program. Not random killings, not war crimes, something bigger. A coordinated, bureaucratic program to murder every Jewish person in Europe, every Roma, every undesirable. The Nazis had documented much of it themselves: deportation records, transport schedules, accounting of stolen property. They'd treated genocide like a business operation. Liberating the camps created immediate medical emergencies. The 7,000 survivors at Auschwitz needed immediate care. But Soviet field hospitals weren't prepared. They had supplies for combat wounds, not mass starvation and disease. Hundreds of survivors died in the first weeks after liberation. Their bodies couldn't handle food. Typhus spread rapidly. Soviet doctors learned the hard way about refeeding syndrome. Survivors who were given regular food too quickly died from the shock to their systems. They needed careful, gradual reintroduction of nutrition. But in the chaos of the liberation, many doctors didn't know this. One survivor, Otto Dovkulka, remembered, "We survived the Nazis. Then we almost died from the food meant to save us." Typhus forced the Soviets to quarantine entire sections of the camp. Prisoners couldn't leave. New infections appeared daily. For some survivors, this was unbearable. They'd just been freed from imprisonment, and now they were imprisoned again, even if it was for their own safety. Some tried to escape the quarantine. Guards had to stop them. The irony was crushing. As survivors regained strength, they began searching for family members. Lists were posted, names of survivors, names of the dead. People wandered from camp to camp, looking for wives, husbands, children, parents. Most searches ended in grief. Entire families had been wiped out. Thousands of children had survived without parents. Soviet authorities set up orphanages in nearby towns, but these children were traumatized beyond measure. Many couldn't speak. Some didn't remember their real names. The Nazis had replaced them with numbers tattooed on their arms. Soviet child psychologists had no training for this level of trauma. The liberation created a massive displacement crisis. Survivors couldn't return home. Many came from places that no longer existed, towns wiped off the map, villages where every Jew had been deported and killed. Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Hungary. There was nothing to go back to. Even if the places existed, many survivors couldn't face returning. Too many memories, too much loss. The Soviet liberation of Auschwitz quickly became politicized. Stalin's regime used it for propaganda, Soviet heroism, liberating Europe from fascism. but they downplayed the specifically Jewish nature of the Holocaust. Soviet reports talked about citizens of various nationalities, not Jews. The word appeared rarely in official accounts. Jewish survivors who tried to emphasize the targeted nature of the genocide found their testimonies edited or suppressed. The Soviet narrative needed the Holocaust to be about fascism versus communism, not about anti-Semitism. This frustrated many Soviet Jewish soldiers who'd participated in the liberation. They'd seen specifically Jewish victims. They knew this was targeted genocide. Soviet filmmakers who documented the liberation had their footage censored. Scenes showing Jewish symbols, prayer shawls, Stars of David were cut from official releases. The full footage wouldn't be seen in the Soviet Union for decades. This created a second tragedy. Survivors liberated from Nazi silence were pushed into Soviet silence. The Soviet soldiers who liberated Auschwitz carried the experience for the rest of their lives. Many developed what we'd now call PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, survivors' guilt about seeing it after the fact rather than being able to prevent it. Lieutenant Petrenko wrote years later, "I wish I could forget." But forgetting would be a betrayal of the dead. Many liberators couldn't talk about what they'd seen, not with family, not with friends. The trauma was too deep. A soldier named Georgy Elizavetsky didn't tell his wife about Auschwitz until 40 years after the war. When he finally spoke, he wept for hours. "How do you describe hell to someone who's never been there?" he asked. Some Soviet liberators felt a sense of responsibility for the survivors. They'd arrived too late to prevent the deaths. The least they could do was bear witness. Major Shapiro spent months after liberation documenting testimonies, recording names, preserving evidence. He knew the Nazis would be tried. He wanted to make sure there was proof, that the world couldn't deny what happened. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945. Soviet evidence from Auschwitz and other camps formed part of the prosecution. Nazi leaders claimed they didn't know about the death camps, that they were just following orders, that the scale was exaggerated. The evidence proved otherwise. Documents, photographs, testimonies, physical evidence. 12 Nazi leaders were sentenced to death. Others received long prison sentences. But justice felt inadequate. How do you punish people who murdered millions? What sentence matches that crime? Many survivors felt the trials were necessary but insufficient. No punishment could balance the scales. Thousands of Nazis escaped justice. They fled to South America, the Middle East, even to the United States. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the deportation system, lived in Argentina until Israeli agents captured him in 1960. Dr. Mengele escaped and died in Brazil in 1979. Never tried, never punished. Almost immediately, Holocaust denial began. People claiming it never happened, or was exaggerated, or was Allied propaganda. This enraged the Soviet liberators. They'd seen it with their own eyes, touched the barracks, smelled the crematoria, held dying survivors. "How dare anyone say it didn't happen?" Petrenko said. "I was there. I saw. I will never unsee." In 1947, Poland established Auschwitz as a memorial and museum. The Soviet government supported this, seeing it as evidence of fascist crimes. But the early memorial emphasized Polish victims over Jewish ones, the Soviet political narrative again. It wasn't until decades later that the specifically Jewish nature of Auschwitz was fully acknowledged in the official memorial. Survivors began publishing accounts. Primo Levi's "If This Is a Man", Elie Wiesel's "Night", Viktor Frankl's "Man's Search for Meaning". These books gave voice to the voiceless, preserved memory, ensured the world couldn't forget. But many survivors never spoke. The trauma was too deep. Some wrote testimonies that weren't published until after their deaths. The liberation of Auschwitz changed how the world understood evil. Before, war crimes were seen as excesses of war, terrible but comprehensible within the context of military conflict. The death camps revealed something different: systematic, bureaucratic, industrial genocide, evil as state policy. In 1949, the Geneva Conventions were updated. New protections for civilians, new definitions of war crimes, new concepts like crimes against humanity and genocide. These legal frameworks were direct responses to what the Soviets and other allies found in the camps. The world recognized it needed new language, new laws to address what the Nazis had done. The liberation also changed understanding of trauma: survivor syndrome, transgenerational trauma, the psychological wounds that pass from survivors to their children and grandchildren. The Soviet doctors who first examined survivors had no framework for this, but their observations laid groundwork for future trauma research. The liberators carried one question for the rest of their lives: how did this happen? How did ordinary people become perpetrators? How did doctors become executioners? How did a modern, educated nation build factories of death? There were no satisfying answers, just the disturbing realization that it could happen, that humans were capable of this. Many liberators became anti-fascist activists after the war. They gave lectures, wrote books, testified at trials. Their message was consistent: this must never happen again, and the only way to prevent it is to remember, to bear witness, to never let the world forget. Lieutenant Petrenko spoke at schools until he was 89 years old. Young people must know, he said, must see the photographs, must hear the stories, because the dead cannot speak, we speak for them. Decades after liberation, some Soviet liberators reconnected with survivors they'd helped. Emotional reunions, tears, embraces. The survivors thanking the soldiers for saving their lives. The soldiers thanking the survivors for surviving, for being witnesses. One reunion in 1985 brought together 30 liberators and 200 survivors at Auschwitz. They walked through the camp together. Both groups carried trauma: the survivors from what they'd endured, the liberators from what they'd witnessed. They found something in common: the need to tell the story, to make sure the world knew, to honor the dead. A survivor named Ruth Kluger said, "We survived because soldiers came. They gave us life twice, once by liberating us and again by believing us when we told what happened." By the 2020s, few liberators remained alive. Most were teenagers in 1945. By 2025, they're in their 90s or have passed away. The last Soviet liberators of Auschwitz are dying, taking their first-hand accounts with them. This makes documentation crucial: video testimonies, oral histories, preserved accounts. In 2020, David Dushman, the last surviving Soviet liberator of Auschwitz, died at age 98. Before his death, he gave one final interview, describing January 27, 1945, the silence, the smoke, the survivors. "I still see their faces," he said. "Every day of my life, I will see them until I die, and even then, I hope I see them, so I can tell them. I remembered. I told the world. I kept my promise." He paused, then added, "That is all any of us can do. Now the responsibility falls to us, the generation that never knew the survivors, never met the liberators. We have only their testimonies, their photographs, their warnings. The question is, will we listen? Will we remember? Will we prevent it from happening again?" Genocide didn't end with the Holocaust. Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, Myanmar. The patterns repeat. The warnings are ignored. The world says, "never again," and then stands by while it happens again. The Soviet soldiers who liberated Auschwitz saw the worst of humanity, but they also believed in the best, that bearing witness matters, that truth matters, that memory is resistance. There's a photograph from January 27, 1945. A Soviet soldier standing at the gates of Auschwitz, staring into the camp. His face shows everything: